you so much for being here. I'm going to go through a PowerPoint presentation. There's a lot of information, and I have found that this is sort of the best way to get the information out to you. Before I start that, are there any members of the press here? Great. Thank you so much. And we have a videographer in the corner, and she's the only person who's going to be videotaping, so if you are videotaping, please don't. Please, oh, thank you very much. Thank you. You don't have permission to videotape, but the only videographer is right there. So education in Wyoming in the Common Core. This is a very complicated subject, even though many would like it to be very simple. Many would like it to simply be about Common Core, about a set of standards, about rigor, and about exciting new things in the classroom. But this is a whole lot more than that. Section 1, I'm just going to go over just a brief summary of the history of federal involvement in education from basically the 60s on. Then Section 2, I'm going to explain to you how we got the Common Core here in Wyoming. And then Section 3, I'm going to talk about some possible ways to get out. Starting in 1960, it was really in the 50s, but in 1964 is when we saw the big reach into public education. Before that, public education truly was local and state education. In 1964, under Lyndon Johnson, he created the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And this was part of Johnson's war on poverty. Johnson described the law as the most sweeping education bill ever to come before Congress. It represents a major new commitment of the federal government to quality and equality in schooling that we offer our young people. And this was it really came about as part of Johnson's Great Society. This idea that we were going to have a much more managed society, and also it came out of a cry for equality due to segregation. In there we have the ESA program known as Title I. Title I is a very big program, reaches into every one of our schools. Every school district has Title I dollars, and they use them and they depend upon them. ESEA was the first real government clearing call for federal involvement in public education. And I say that because it was couched in a way that was very clear that the federal government had something that states and local districts simply could not provide. So I don't mean just that the federal government magnanimously wanted to give us some of our money back to help with education, but rather Johnson said the federal government can do something that the states cannot do. So that makes a difference. In the 70s, in 1979, President Carter signed the Department of Education Reorganization Act. Between 64 and 79, there was a lot of discussion about the amount of federal dollars that were flowing into the states. At that time, it was coming through the Office of Education federally. President Carter decided to bump the Office of Education up to the Department of Education, making it a cabinet-level position and giving it a tremendous amount of federal power. Cabinet positions and departments in the federal government have a lot more power than just an office. And that's why from that point on, we now have secretaries of education, and every president who's been elected since President Carter always roll out a new education agenda federally. So with that change, we saw a whole new era in federal involvement. Ronald Reagan, very interesting. Ronald Reagan in the 1980s actually ran on a policy of eliminating what Carter had just done. And there was a lot of discussion nationally because this was a big change. Unfortunately, President Reagan's second secretary, the second Secretary of Education, Terrence Bell, formed the National Commission on Excellence in Education and released, and some of you may remember this, A Nation at Risk. The imperative for education reform. And in there were 38 findings. One of those findings said, we believe the federal government's role includes several functions of national consequence that states and localities alone are unlikely to be able to meet. So there you go. A Nation at Risk really solidified what President Johnson had begun. So what started as Johnson's dream of a great society and was really clarified by President Carter was being solidified, sadly, under President Reagan. And it moved education and federal involvement in education forward. Then in the 90s, under President Clinton, we had Goals 2000, the Educate America Act. And here's where we see the precursor to the Common Core. This was the first big push President Clinton created the National Education Standards and Improvement Council, and it was there to certify and periodically review voluntary national content standards and voluntary national student performance standards that define what all students shall know and be able to do. That was resoundingly rejected nationally, and there was a fairly large cry. And what the proponents of a national standard learned very cleverly is don't use the word national. It's a bad word, and you're not going to get it through if you call it national. So Goals 2000 also had a list of other goals in it. All children in America will start school ready to learn. So President Clinton, just as President Obama, was very interested in preschool and universal preschool. High school graduation rates would increase to at least 90%. And this was in 94. We are still nationally stubbornly at about 78% graduation rate. So all of Goals 2000's goals and all of the federal money didn't change that. The US students would be first in the world in math and science. That was one of Goal 2000's goals. We are 25th in math worldwide and 17th in science. So we didn't achieve that goal either. Going on, in the early 2000s, we had No Child Left Behind. And most of you, or many of you probably have heard about No Child Left Behind. That is what states right now are operating underneath. It included a host of new education reforms that centered around measuring accountability. That sort of became the new buzzword. The federal government set AMOs, and AMOs are annual measurable objectives. Under that, states had to basically measure their AMOs using AYP. States would build also a statewide standardized test to measure the proficiency level of all students based on those objectives. Now, one of the big goals of No Child Left Behind is that the states would achieve 100% proficiency in math and reading by 2014. And as we're sitting here in July of 2013, it's fairly important to sort of remember that. So keep that in mind, because I'm going to talk about that when we talk about flexibility waivers. 2009 to present, now we have the Common Core race to the top and flexibility waivers. Many of the proponents of the Common Core have said that this is not a national attempt, that this is a state-led attempt. However, you just cannot make that connection. First of all, no one from Wyoming informed the creation and the content in the Common Core. So no content standard expert in the state of Wyoming had any involvement in creating the Common Core. The trade associations, the National Governors Association, who keeps its membership list private, and the trade association, the Council of Chief State School Officers, commissioned a company called Achieving to write the standards. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation began granting millions of dollars to the institutions, trade associations, and think tanks that work alongside state bureaucrats and policymakers in the development of state-level education policy. So, for example, the Gates Foundation gave the National Association of State School Boards and the Council of State Governments, now the CSG, the Council of State Governments, Wyoming belongs to that. Our legislators go to functions, they go to events, they go to national meetings of CSG. They gave more than $2.2 million to convene regional meetings for policymakers to increase member knowledge. So the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation spent an awful lot of money attempting to sort of win over these folks very, very quickly. Some important points to remember. No federal legislation, so that means Congress, has been used for implementing the Common Core. All of the Race to the Top grant money was not approved by Congress, and the flexibility waivers were not approved by Congress. So for states like Wyoming also, no state legislative action was taken to adopt or accept any of these as well. Now in Wyoming, state standards are statutorily given to the State Board of Education, which is an unelected board that is appointed by the governor. So in actuality, content standards, which are reviewed every 5 years in Wyoming, don't usually get legislative action. But you have to remember that these standards are changing really fundamentally changing the playing field in a way that they haven't before. And they are directly tied to a number of federal strings that have significant fiscal impact to this state. It is your elected legislature who holds the purse strings and who should be deciding fiscal matters, but that is not what is happening or has been happening in Wyoming.